This week we would like to talk a little about Vincent van Gogh and show you a little of his techniques. I have here a made-up still life. It's artificial. Of course, this is not naughty because the old masters always used artificial flowers if they took a long time, and a few Japanese prints to show the effect on Impressionism generally Japanese prints had, and I'll try to paint him from memory in the picture over here. As usual, as we go along, I'll endeavour to tell you a little of his life, which we all know was tragically ended after 10 years of painting, and sadly led to his death, a suicide attempt. And in those short 10 years, he established not only his own way of painting, but taught a philosophy of life. Of course, he was born in Holland in March 1853, and he died in July 1890 in Arles in France. He was born of Dutch parents of the Protestant religion. His father was a priest, vicar, and he had a brother, sister, and a very normal middle-class upbringing at this time. He was educated and so on, but he wanted to be a priest, and he failed in this because of his nature, which was a bit too, let's say, left-wing for the right-wing attitude of the priesthood at that time. He was very much taken with the poverty around him, and so he tried to do something about it, and they failed him on this account, and he decided to go into the art business. His uncle, Van Gogh, kept an art shop or two, one in London, one in Paris, and this is where we touch upon Vincent's life in London, because he lived at Isleworth and other parts of London. He taught there English. He fell in love with his landlady's daughter. That was his second love affair that he failed in. And of course, with due respect to the ladies, they seemed to cause a bit of bother with the boys. And of course, it was the reason why he escaped into his work, because he considered himself ugly physically. He wasn't all that beautiful, but at the same time he wasn't all that ugly, in my opinion, but he had this rather frightening expression, intense expression, that is often mistaken for madness. So he worked for a little while in London and in Paris, unsuccessfully again because he's not a businessman. And then he decided to become a painter. He had quite a good training in the sense of a friendly people like Anton Mauve was one chap who taught him, and other lesser-known painters. But mainly he taught himself from books and studying on his own. And of course his predilection was to go out into the country and draw. He learned much from his Dutch contemporaries, and he learned much from the Dutch masters, Rembrandt, and incredibly enough, he was much influenced by Frans Hals. He went down to Paris, where of course he had the good fortune to meet quite a lot of Impressionists, an incredible amount really. It had been all the rage. We remember, we're now talking in the 1880s, and Impressionism had come and gone. And we're now in 10 years after its zenith, as it were. He went to the Pont-Aven group in Brittany, where he met Bernard. With Bernard, of course, worked Gogh, an Australian painter called John Russell, Signa, and others, too numerous to mention. And then he went down to Arles to start in the Yellow House a new life, where he hoped his friends, the other artists, would join him there, making an arrangement with his brother Theo to keep him. And Theo sent Vincent money every month and canvases and paints and kept him financially. Now the object of this operation is I'm blocking it in as I'm talking very crudely. It doesn't matter about this because what I'm doing is killing the canvases. With Vincent, you don't necessarily have to have the vibrancy you would on a Renaissance panel or something, because he painted very thickly. He used the palette knife a lot, of course, and bristle brushes. It's amazing how the so-called Venetian technique of complementary colours under and over each other permeate throughout the whole of art practically. Now in the Venetian technique, of course, you have a red bowl underpainting or khaki or something like that, usually red bowl, and you paint thickly the complementary colour of whatever it is. I showed this in a previous program. But here we have a different attitude, but utilising the technique of the Venetians in very simply painting the opposite colour to what I'm going to put on top. Now these are sunflowers because we associate Vincent with sunflowers, and the complementary of yellow is of course blue. So I've washed in very thinly a bluish colour without any attempt to paint flowers or anything. Vincent's hair was of course ginger, red, Titian in colour. So we do this opposite colour to that, blocking it in. Then we remember our anatomy. He was interested himself in this, and we emphasise a little bit the skull, painting his eyes as a socket, the bridge of the nose, and of course he was is going to be bearded in this portrait. This painting is now very crudely underpainted. There is no way you can say that Vincent had a certain technique. He had, like most painters, many, especially a man of his nature who learned much. At this moment, I'm just making up a make-up face of Vincent, more or less from memory. This is a kind of wash I'm putting on to show the colour coming through a bit here and there. Of course, his idea was to paint alla prima in one go. It was considered manly to stand back and bang away at a canvas with great confidence and just make one definite statement here and there. Of course, the problem is with that, once you've made it, it's got to be scraped off if it's wrong, and doesn't lend itself for an impressionist technique in this sense. But the beauty of Vincent's own kind of painting, when he eventually achieved the form of self-expression, was that his own personality forced itself, by virtue of his application, to become the kind of late paintings we know of Vincent, with the whirls and the struggling and the almost frenetic activity of the paintwork. We were going to give him a blue jacket, and his method, as with Renoir, Monet, Manet, all these fellows, was to, they usually piped, they were piped. I'm not a tailor, but I believe it means the edges of lapels and that were piped with a different colour. Of course, that's done at the end. But they wore these, well, of course, Victorian, with sleeves up as almost a relic of the 18th century cuffs. And he would give it all vigorous strokes, very crudely painted, but of course from a distance it registers. When I gave the painting a coat of underpainting, it was in order to emphasize the blueness of these strokes, and of course he would work about this speed, only with oils. I'm still using tempera for the purposes. of explaining. Green, blue, any cold colour will register. It's best to, in this technique, to mix as many blues as you have on the palette and to mix them in directional brush strokes. Remember, there's a body under here, and you can qualify it after. Vincent van Gogh, of course, was associated with, of course, his sunflowers, which he adored, but of course he painted many other types of flowers. In fact, he painted and drew practically every possible thing there was in the book, and from books, quite often. His drawing of the seed bed of sunflowers is in a gallery in Gogh in Switzerland. Is an excellent botanical drawing, worthy of looking at because it shows the magical concentric circles which we associate with the golden section. This, of course, is a dissertation on its own, but we do mention it now and again. And he was aware of this. I mean, I'm illustrating this to show that he was not the ignorant Dutch mad peasant that most people like to feel he was. Of course he wasn't a cretin and a lunatic. He was highly intelligent and sensitive, and had, the only failing he had was that he was so young that he lacked the training to be a painter. It takes donkey's years to become a painter. Very few painters and sculptors in the history of mankind are born with the gift to do academic painting or whatever straight away. You have to be taught it and learn it and study it and practice it and so on. I have a feeling, it's only a personal feeling from studying, that when Van Gogh was down at Arles, his great dream of creating a brotherhood of painters down there, and invited, of course, as we know, Gogh and Bernard and Signon and many other chaps, and he hoped to found a kind of Pont-Avon school in the sun. And of course the inevitable happened, that the conflict of personalities. It's one thing to talk in a cafe a bit squiffy about the aesthetics of painting, it's another to have to live with someone. And although I love Vincent very much, he probably was quite difficult, I should think. He was, for one thing, he was very untidy. I can't complain, I'm untidy myself, but it is a bit irksome when you get someone, say, who's an ex-sailor, like Gogh had been around and knew the discipline of a ship. I think he only stayed there about 3 months. Then they had the tragic business of Vincent having a bit of a bad turn and cutting part of his ear off. Apparently it was something to do with it. He was madly in love with a waitress or something and sent it round as a little present for a birthday. There were various stories about it. Whatever transpired, it was symptomatic of the depression he was feeling with the eternal arguments of the two men. Vincent's technique varied enormously throughout his life, and he worked quite often in stabbed strokes of thick colour, applying it similar to this. It seems somehow to be affected by his mood of the moment, that sometimes he was in ecstasy with a landscape, sometimes in despair. According to his moods, he would paint, and his technique seemed to, naturally, of course it would, it alters in a man like this. So if he was happy, he would paint very quickly and be jolly like this, and if he was sad, he would be more lugubrious and slow, and his colours would alter accordingly, or perhaps he'd have the courage, which often comes from despair, of painting a happy picture when his heart was breaking, like a Pagliacci with the palette. I'm using this kind of cross brushstroke almost automatically as I'm talking, because this is the brushstroke he would have used. He allowed the thickness of the paint to tell the story. It's a directional painting plus texture. He quite bravely painted his hair, or any part of the picture, green or bright red. This is, you have to follow the same technique of the painting right through. And although it looks crude, and is in fact crude relative to the smooth paintings of some masters, it registers as a modern, as they call them, a modern painting, decorative. See how fast you can alter the expression simply by the central area of the forehead, these lines here. These lines here above the eyes, the actual top eyelid, if a lateral movement made up gives a look of sorrow, if just the one line on each will give a look, and this related, and because this is the movement in painting, lines that go upward and outward toward the corner of the canvas, as it were, express joy, and those that go in the contrary direction express sorrow. And here and there you'll find you will naturally, in a painting like this, move towards the actual rhythm. The rhythm comes with you as you're thinking about the rhythm, and this is the way he worked in the fields where the madness overtook him, and this kind of pattern must, the feeling, I have an urge now, very strong urge to, without acting or anything, a kind of natural talking about and thinking of him, I feel as I need to do these almost involuntary movements of the kind of swirling, the inexplicable need to surge upwards in a spiral. This is probably a natural reaction to pain or unhappiness. He tended, like most people who read a lot or stare a lot into, like painters, to frown as a kind of an intellectual frown, not to be confused with the frown of a battle axe. These harridans that frown at you, usually landladies over breakfast. And this is probably what frightened people of him, because he had these intense eyes, emphasized by, of course, ginger eyebrows and red hair, and so that he gave this appearance of a madman. Vincent wasn't a violent man at all. He was very gentle, Christ-like figure. Indeed, he really crucified himself. I always, without being blasphemous, feel that he was, to me anyway, he's near to Christ as us poor creatures can never get, because he gave an example in his life of giving, generosity of spirit and mind. His hair had apparently had glints in it. I actually knew a man who had met him, so I have kind of first-hand information. It isn't all that long ago. It's only, I don't know, 40, 50 years before I was born that he was creeping about in Amsterdam. I'd like to now qualify the hands a little. Now, his writing and his own hands were quite coarse in a way, because he worked very hard. He carted easels, and anyone's carted easels and canvases through the countryside and climbing over fences and whatever. This is before, of course, the transport we have today. So you have a very strong hand, and in fact that reminds me, invariably he ended his letters to Theo, yours with a strong handshake, which is a rather lovely expression to use to your brother. he would apply the paint quite quickly. And of course, this is once upon a time, of course, when Rembrandt first applied impasto and was criticised for it, some old boy came in the studio and said, went up closely to the painting, said the paint's too thick, and of course Rembrandt said, paintings are meant to be seen and not smelled, and the same thing applies because much of the beauty of the Impressionist school generally is in their exquisite use of thicks and thins. And I often wonder how poor Theo managed to keep Vincent in paint. He used an enormous amount in the 10 years of his life. There's a little letter here which has 2 stamps on it. I'll put those on in colour later. Which will have Theo's name and address in Paris. Is just writing to him. We're imagining all this, but of course it did happen. Vincent's own technique, as we know it now in his late years, is virtually unique. I should say is unique. No one's ever really painted in the Van Gogh style in that way because it's too personal. It's a kind of a vortex painting of spirals, and only someone with incredible feeling and purpose behind it, of despair mixed with love. It's a very difficult way to describe it, but I don't think anyone could ever paint like Vincent again, not with any sincerity anyway. Sadly, he only had a productive period of about 8 years before the despair of not selling his work, I think, and his illness also being kept is not a very dignified way of existing for a person of any kind, especially anyone who is sensitive. And we lost him because of the stupidity of people. And he shot himself when he should have gone out, I think, and shot a few art dealers. And of course, the old story, as soon as he was dead, his work became valuable very quickly. Now it's worth a king's ransom. Vincent, of course, his lovely love of blue, used to draw these lines around things to give them a little area of their own. Of course, he was aware of the fact, of course, that blue goes away, and like Renoir, he would, and Turner and so on, they all knew the value of this colour, which we associate with the sky. Considering his sad state of mind, his paintings retain a great vigour and a happiness, his sunflowers, so on, and this incredible way his paint took on a living kind of vitality of its own, especially when he was possessed. It's possible he could have been a spiritualist or something. I don't know. That one feels that a bit. But anyway, we'll just say goodbye to him now. I think that's about all I can do tonight. Thank you very much.